This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 2015's Spectre, the 24th James Bond film. And this is a fascinating movie to me, if only because Daniel Craig's Bond was a more lean, mean, brutal, kind of, I think at one point he was described as a blunt instrument. And that perfectly fits his characterization of Bond. He's sophisticated, but not too sophisticated. He's worldly, but not too worldly. And he's not afraid to get dirty at all. And that's a fitting portrayal of James Bond, especially in these times. But at the same time, what's interesting though is the movies are going in the opposite direction, in the sense that Skyfall was big. And its sequel, Spectre, is even bigger. In fact, I would describe this movie as bloated. There's so many plot threads, and there's so much going on that doesn't necessarily need to be happening, so it feels very long. And there's set pieces to break the monotony, but at the same time, this is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the most enjoyable Bond film to watch. And for one reason, as I said, it's bloated. This could have used some judicious cutting in the editing room. And also it's worth mentioning that Craig's Bond is somewhat humorless. He has occasional one-liners, but the tone is very straight-laced. Not grim by any stretch, but there's no laughter really in this depiction of Bond, unlike, let's say, Roger Moore. And it's just not an enjoyable watch. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying it's a bad movie. I'm not saying that it's not worth seeing, especially if you're a James Bond completist. By all means, see Spectre if you haven't already. If you're a completist, you probably saw it way before now. But the thing is, it's not a particularly enjoyable film. It goes all over the world, but feels a part of nothing. It just, Bond goes to a place, things happen. Bond goes to this place, things happen. And I know that's a gross simplification, but when you can't invest in the character, that's what you get. And another thing I think doesn't work in its favor is that the characters, the supporting cast such as M, Money, Penny, and Q, they're okay, but they're not very interesting. If you recall the prior James Bond movies, for instance, Q was an older gentleman, but also very humorous at times. And he had a camaraderie with Bond, which makes sense. With this version, Q helps Bond, but there's no real bond between them. And it just feels like kind of rote, and it's not very interesting to watch. And that, I would argue, is Bond's relationship to most of the supporting characters in this movie. They're just not very interesting relationships. And they're not very human relationships either. The first two movies or so, that's not too big a deal. Well, I'd say the first movie, it's an introduction to this version of Bond. Not too big a deal. Second movie, it's getting a little tired. And so that's, the Quantum of Solace, Casino Royale, Skyfall, Spectre. By this point, it just doesn't feel there's anything enjoyable about these movies in and of themselves. Say what you will about the Roger Moore James Bonds. They're silly, they're sexist, they're occasionally racist, but at the same time, Roger Moore seemed to be having a good time doing it, and that was infectious. While Daniel Craig, conversely, he doesn't seem to hate what he's doing, but he doesn't seem to be having much fun at it either. And it's reflected by his depiction of Bond, which again is very stoic, which is very, just not terribly engaging. And I get in the Daniel Craig Bond movies, he's gone more in the direction of a Jason Bourne type character, but that character is just not very engaging. He's rather humorless, and so much effort has been taken to make him appear more human that it's just making me not interested in Bond as a character. Because the most fascinating thing to me about James Bond was the distance between the world he lived in and the world I live in. He was always larger than life. He was always more witty and more clever than the next guy. Daniel Craig's Bond is grounded. And that, in this context, makes him a little boring, to be totally honest with you. One of the most fascinating things about the James Bond franchise is the way it changes based upon the actor who is James Bond. The Sean Connery James Bond is different from the Roger Moore James Bond, which is different from the Timothy Dalton James Bond, which is different from the Pierce Brosnan James Bond, which is different from the Daniel Craig James Bond. So if you're not at all crazy about the direction Bond currently is in, I wouldn't worry about it too much, because the character changes with the times. It takes a while to get there, admittedly, but he changes with the times. Well, typically, because remember, George Lazenby was a Bond for, I believe, 2 movies, and that didn't work out too well at all. So if this Bond is not what you're into, give it a little time. The upcoming James Bond movie, which as far as anyone is aware, is the last James Bond starring Daniel Craig. And that's a good thing, because his Bond isn't a bad Bond. In fact, I would rank it probably slightly above Timothy Dalton's portrayal, but below Pierce Brosnan's. And it's just, as depicted, his Bond is very limited range. And that's not great for the franchise. It needs to grow. It needs a Bond that's more interesting, whatever that means to the producers. Another thing I thought it's worth mentioning is that the current Bond movies, particularly Skyfall and Spectre, it's very personal to Bond. And that's kind of tiring also. I mentioned earlier about what's most exciting about James Bond is how he is beyond what we know and who we are as an individual. He lives a life 9.5 out of 10 people cannot live. And that's one of the things that makes him interesting. But when you ground him, he becomes, just by default, less interesting. And that's what happened in Skyfall to a lesser extent, and in Spectre to a much, much greater extent. Everything revolves around James Bond. Everything is connected to him. If you recall past James Bond movies, that was never the case. So things would happen, Bond gets involved, adventure ensues. He had no relation to what was going on, for the most part, in his personal life, which we knew nothing about, for the most part, because it's just not relevant to what's happening. And to be totally honest, I want to get back to that Bond. I want a Bond that, while it doesn't go into the ridiculous, like with Die Another Day, that's more humorous, more doesn't take all this quite so seriously like the Roger Moore Bond. We'll see. After all, as I said, the upcoming James Bond movie will probably be the last starring Daniel Craig, and who knows how that character will be interpreted in future. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Peace.